What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another episode of Lions Latest, going through the latest Detroit Lions news. And today, we're here to discuss the takeaways that we have from Dan Campbell's little media presser. So let's get it started. Welcome, everybody, to a video. Glad you guys are here. And yes, we're back with some Detroit Lions news. And this is really just going to be reacting to what Dan Campbell spoke to the media about today. Now, we've had some NFL rule changes that have been implemented. We're also getting updates about, hey, there's going to be a doubleheader on Christmas, which I'm super excited about. I think that's pretty awesome. But also, we have the rule changes like the kickoff rule, and then also, of course, the hip drop tackle. Those have been two things that have been spoken about a ton. But also, we got to hear from Dan Campbell, and he gave us some insight because it's been a while since we've heard from these guys, and I wanted to discuss a few of the key notes that I took from what he said today. Now, before we get into that, quick little update. In the community tab right now, there is a link to our Bleacher Report show that we did yesterday. We did a couple of Lions-only mock drafts, a couple 7-round mocks, my first ones that I've done. So if you guys want to see those, feel free to check those out. We are going to be live tonight with Easy, as usual. May also have another guest in there as well. And we're going to talk mock drafts. Stay tuned for that. But right now, let's talk about this news. So we're just going to kind of roll through it as I took my notes from today's little media presser that we had. But the big one first, and this is Josh Reynolds, who is still a free agent, the receiver that was with the Lions the last couple of seasons. And he was a guy that coming into free agency, I thought for sure, no question, this guy was going to be re-signed. He would be brought back as a Lion. And one thing that I can say about the Lions that I do love when you talk about the free agency approach, not from like a whole approach aspect, but just in terms of if a guy produces, you can expect that the Lions are probably going to make an effort to re-sign that player. It may or may not happen. You know, players could have an opportunity to go get paid more elsewhere, and I think that's a lot of what's probably going on right now with the Josh Reynolds situation. Really, as I said, once Marquise Brown got taken off the market, I think Josh Reynolds is hands down the best receiver on the market.
Yeah, so look, certainly we're still in contact with J. Ray, all right? You know, I don't think it's a secret what we think about him as far as the type of player he is, the unselfishness, the dirty work, the versatility. So, look, I love J. Ray, and that doesn't mean something won't get done.
Also have Mike Williams now, who is off the board as well. So I think that's a huge aspect that maybe Josh Reynolds is looking to get a solid payday. He visited with the Baltimore Ravens. This could be that opportunity to maybe get that last, like, really nice deal. So I can understand him just going on the market and saying, hey, what the heck is out there? Let me just see what's out there because I'm coming off a really strong season, even though it had a kind of a rocky finish. But we also know that the Lions will likely have interest because of what he's done for this Lions team. And that is the case from what we gathered here from what Dan Campbell said today, that they are still in contact with Josh Reynolds for all of the reasons that you would expect, the toughness, the nastiness that he brings. We talk about as a blocker, which Josh Reynolds is one of the better receiver blockers out there. He's one of the better ones on our team. The usage that they have for him, obviously the element that he also adds to this offense, whether that's comfortability with Jared Goff, but also just his fit in the offense to some of the route tree that he expands upon what we currently have on the roster. He kind of separates himself a little bit as well for what we have. And then also on top of that, it's just his feel within the offense. Obviously, you come into training camp, he's going to know where he's supposed to be at. He's going to understand what the offense is looking for. But at the same time, what Josh Reynolds is going to bring to the table from a statistical side, right? He's not going to be an elite number one receiver. You understand that there's certain games where he may be taken out of the game more than others, but he's also very reliable. I mean, he had some tough drops in that San Fran game, but for the most part, very reliable hands. You know what route tree he's going to be successful with, and his timing within the offense as a route runner, to me, is what separates him. That's what makes him special in this offense, is his timing. And he also comes through in clutch moments. We know that St. Brown is usually that guy, and he was in the playoffs, but so was Josh Reynolds. And if you just think about the way that he popped against the LA Rams, like, you can't forget about what he brought to the table in that game. It was like, oh my goodness, look at this guy. Still a big-time clutch receiver for the Lions. So I expect him to continue to have interest. I still believe that at some point Josh Reynolds is going to end up being back as a Lion. I also read, and I believe this is from Brad Holmes, I didn't see the video, but I read that he was one of the guys that's still part of their kind of like original plan hitting free agency. He's like the last guy that's part of that original plan that they want to get back. So we're just kind of waiting to see right now. Who knows if it's going to happen? I think there's probably interest from other teams out there. There's a reason that he had a visit with the Ravens. He also touched on bringing back Donovan Peoples-Jones and how Peoples-Jones now with some experience within this offense, of course, the size, which is much different than any other receiver that they really have in this room. He kind of pointed to Donovan Peoples-Jones as a little bit of a veteran and a different body type that he could bring. I think it kind of rounds out the room pretty well heading into the draft. So again, you kind of don't have to like force a draft pick there. You feel pretty good about the receiver room. I expect that at some point Josh Reynolds is going to end up getting re-signed here. I just think it makes too much sense, but we'll see. On again, quickly, he kind of touched on the rule changes. Specifically, I want to touch on the kickoff rule changes. So we know that this is going to shake things up big time, and I love it for the most part. I don't love the fact that the onside is so limited seemingly now. Like, I love the idea of a surprise onside kick. I know how massive it was for us, especially in the first year of Dan Campbell and kind of building out this roster. I don't like taking that element away necessarily, where it's like, all right, we're doing an onside kick. Yeah, you can unbalance the formation, but I still don't love that. However, the kickoff rule in general, to make that a real thing again, where it's like, hey, guys are actually returning kickoffs, I do love that. Now, my one little fear, and we'll have to see how this plays out, would be that too often you're getting teams that are starting way too far. Like, I don't want teams consistently starting at their own 30-plus yard line. In some ways, especially with how today's NFL is going, I kind of want the NFL to, like, maybe if the rules didn't change, I would have kind of liked the NFL to like bring it back to, hey, a touchback, you start at the 20-yard line, not the 25. Like, I just feel like right now in today's NFL, with how the rules kind of seemingly push towards the offense, I wouldn't have an issue with them being like, you know what, start a little bit further back. But that's really my only main concern with this. I love the aspect of kickoffs being more involved. Lions value special teams. You can see that by the free agent re-signings alone, or the additions that they've made and how much they put a value in that, especially now when you talk about the draft. And Dan Campbell brings to the point that there could be a lot of players drafted this year that maybe don't start right away because of where the roster is at. Special teams is valuable because you're going to make the roster. We're going to need you to be on the field in some way, shape, or form. To be honest, my concern there probably isn't extremely warranted, because if you do look at the kickoff rules, it seems like it's going to be putting a lot of stress on the kickers to lay a good kick, because now how they're lining up, from my understanding, right? So you're going to still kick from your own 35-yard line. Obviously, the receiving team between the 30 and 35-yard line. The 9 players there, you can have up to 2 returners behind that. But now with that goal zone being from the goal line to the 20-yard line, but now any kick that bounces from the landing zone into the end zone must be returned or downed. And now if you down it for a touchback, it only takes it to the 20-yard line. And then obviously for the kicking team, there's much more stress on laying a good kick, because if you don't get it there, now all of a sudden the receiving team would get it at the 40-yard line. And then also on top of that, if you just kick it straight into the end zone, the receiving team gets at the 30-yard line. So it definitely activates not only just the fact that there's now a kick return, but also the kickers, laying a pretty good kick. Of course, they had a couple of other rule changes. Nothing I really want to go into deep here, but first off, the Lions proposed rule, which is, hey, if I get a challenge successful, can I get a third challenge? Which they're like, hey, yeah, we're going to make that a thing. So that's awesome. You can now have a third challenge. But then also there's the aspect of, which is kind of the big one to me, which is the game clock and the play clock, where if it's clear and obvious that it hit 0, that they can go review it and see if the play, shouldn't have counted or should have. But I don't know what that's going to look like when they say clear and obvious. I always kind of have reservations about that. Clear and obvious, I mean, really, what are they going to say is clear and obvious? I guess we'll see on that one. Hopefully that helps, because last year was kind of a mess. Sometimes you'd be like, oh, they're going to let you get it to 0. And then other times, like, no, they're not going to let you get it there. And it was like teams were kind of playing both sides. I know we were on both sides of it last season. It was just weird. So having that change seems good. And really the biggest change, and it makes a ton of sense, could be the kickoff returner value could be back. For example, in the XFL, which has gotten a lot of comparisons to what the NFL, even though there's some differences, the XFL had a 97% kickoff return rate versus the NFL, who was at, I believe, 22%. So, I mean, that's just alone changes things. We didn't see a kickoff return, I believe, in the Super Bowl. So that changes things. The kickoff returner value could be brought back, which is really fun. Last season, it was mainly Khalil Dorsey for the Lions as a kick returner. He had 12 kick returns for an average of 20.3 yards, which was not great. We also saw Craig Reynolds. I believe he had a fumble, though, so that's what kind of shook it all up. But 5 kickoff returns for 133 yards. That's 26.6 average, which is really solid. Outside of that, you had, like, here and there, you'd have Mohamed Ibrahim, who had a kick return. So did guys like Zonovan Knight. But that could become much more valuable piece. And as Dan Campbell said, it's not going to shake up things because they've already been kind of thinking about what that's going to look like. And I'm sure that guys like Craig Reynolds, who are set to be back on the roster, at least for training camp, Khalil Dorsey, like these guys, Khalif Raymond, who we saw a year ago, had 2 kickoff returns. Those guys are on the roster so they can compete for this role. But then maybe, yeah, you look for a guy that, hey, maybe he has that aspect in his game. It's more so now, like when I draft a guy, did he have kickoff return experience? Like you could have definitely put that into the conversation more than what it was recently. So I do love love that it makes special teams much more valuable because the Lions already value that, and I think that it's awesome to see when that's really utilized, how much it can change the game. Season 24.5 was the average kick return yards. In the XFL, it was 21.3. I don't know, so maybe that gives you different thoughts on it. With that, continuing on, he also touched on all of their free agent signings, essentially, and just gave like little notes to one, but the biggest one was Carlton Davis. And I know I've given this example multiple times about the Green Bay Packers, but what I did is I dug through my notes, right, and I found this little sheet where I was charting kind of every single play. And I found it because I was like, I don't have the graphic anymore. So I had to dig through. I got like 6 notebooks, and I found the one notebook. I'm like, oh, it's in here. And I kind of went through and just kind of revisited my notes from what the coverage the Lions were playing. And my example I always use is Lions against the Packers on Thanksgiving, because in that game, the Lions, when they played zone coverage, literally could not get Jordan Love off schedule. He was so efficient, it was insane. Then when they would switch to man, they were a lot more successful, but it wasn't perfect because at times, whether that's, Jerry Jacobs, maybe would get beat on a one-on-one, we give up a touchdown there, maybe give up a big play. You could still get beat one-on-one. What happened was when the Lions were able to shift to man and really change with the tendencies, an offense like that was built through the timing, that the timing started to become very strong for that offense. The Lions were unable to get them off script at all unless they shifted into man coverage. And that's what Dan Campbell really talked about, is that, hey, we still want to diversify what we do, but he looks at the ability to play man coverage like the ability to run the football, where it's like, hey, you want to be able to lean on that. First off, the Lions do that a ton on third down. All right, just keep that in mind. A lot of cover zero we see on third down, a lot of blitz, and as he touched on, sometimes you want to be able to pressure a guy and be able to trust your back end. That's something that the Lions love to do. Aspect of the Lions usually play typically a much higher percentage of man coverage. Now, last season that changed. It got more towards the league average of man coverage versus zone coverage in the NFL. Maybe we see some of that shift back, but he didn't feel like they had that Carlton Davis type, who he believes at times, I think depending on matchup especially, where you can kind of tilt coverage and say, hey, leave him one-on-one on the opposite side. Now we can start to send help there. I think one area that will really help the Lions is dealing with mobility of quarterbacks, because perfect example, Seattle a couple years ago, even though statistically our coverage was really strong to end the season, you saw in that game where it was like the Lions had to allocate both safeties to both Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And guys like Justin Jefferson, you're still probably going to want to do that, but when you have to do that, now you're just losing bodies everywhere else. So if you're playing man, you have no bodies to deal with the quarterback. Now the idea of, hey, we don't like to play a spy, that's awesome, but now there's so much pressure on that four-man front to be able to keep that quarterback in the pocket. And even against Geno Smith, who's not really known as a runner, you had trouble with it. So I think it'll help them a lot in that aspect if they can kind of lean into some of the man coverage at times more convincingly. I believe it was 14 of 15 is what Jordan Love was in that game against zone coverage, but I went back through and I kind of charted it. I couldn't read some of what my handwriting from like at the end of the game, but I got to a point where Jordan Love was 12 of 13 against zone coverage versus man coverage, where he was 6 of 12 in that game. So that was the huge thing. It was like the Lions have to be able to kind of change it up, but also be able to lean into man coverage at times. You have to be able to diversify against certain teams that are going to eat up against zone coverage. Like us, for example, if I'm playing the Lions, I'm saying I want to play more man coverage in the past. Now, that may change going forward, but that's how I would want to play the Lions. And if you're playing the Lions and you can't play man coverage, you are in trouble, because Ben Johnson is going to pick you apart. So will Goff in this offensive line. You're going to have issues. These receivers are too good with spacing. They understand the timing. You're going to have problems. But if you can play man at a really high level at times, you can kind of throw us off our game. Think New England, for example. They could play a lot of man coverage. They could throw us off our game. So that's where I think that value comes into play. And again, as Dan Campbell said, doesn't really feel like they've had that Carlton Davis type since they've gotten here. And a big part of that is they haven't really invested in that in the draft, and they're building through the draft. So that's a big part of it. But yes, they haven't really had that piece. And from the games that I went through of Carlton, I went through about 3 or 4 from this past season. Carlton Davis, obviously, traits-wise, much different. Size, length, much different than what we've had. Press, but also when you think about man, don't just think about press, think about off-man coverage, right? Press and man coverage. There's variants of man coverage that you can play, and he does bring that value, but he also brings zone coverage value as well, but really he makes plays on the football. And I do think that Carlton Davis has the upside to be the best cornerback that we've had outside of Brian Branch at this point in time, and he's already shown that on the field. Marcus Davenport, I love the example that he brought up here of really wanting to kind of bring in a guy, complement the strengths of Aiden Hutchinson on the opposite side, who's going to line up against your right tackle majority of the time. And when you look at a guy like Marcus Davenport, majority of the time he plays right defensive end, lines up against your left tackle, so that, but also that he can kind of collapse the pocket, right? He does it with more so force. And immediately, as soon as you start watching Davenport, you see that. It's like, okay, it's not his finesse, it's force, wrecking ball, like he's going to collapse the pocket opposite. And as they said, they kind of want to push that towards Hutch. And when you look at what the Lions have outside of Davenport, not James Houston necessarily, he's been kind of more of like your third down piece. He can get speed off the edge, and it's good. You got to have those guys. He's got the bend, those kind of things. things. But one, Aaron Glenn loves those guys that he feels like can collapse the pocket in today's NFL with so much mobility of quarterbacks. You don't want to win around the edge. You want to win through. But also Josh Paschal, John Kaminsky, guys that'll play defensive end, especially a lot of times opposite of Hutchinson. That's where when I point to and I say that, hey, I don't see edge rusher opposite of Hutch as such a glaring need like some people do. I think, yeah, absolutely, you could add to that, and I have no issue with doing that. We'll see it in the mock drafts. But at the same time, I don't look at it as like the Lions need this. They can't go on without this. I don't look at it that way. Back to the cornerback point, number one, that was to me by far the biggest need, and they've addressed that in a really good way. 28.2% pressure rate, which was first in the NFL, yet they only had 41 sacks. That was 23rd in the NFL. So, well, yes, I do feel like for the Lions, that's too much pressure to get with not that many sacks. And to me, the major culprit of that is cornerback play, where at times statistically it could look good, but the cornerback play was just not there. And a big part of that is they haven't really invested in that position in the draft. And he does feel like Carlton Davis is kind of a player that they just have not had since they've gotten here, and I would agree with that. I kind of laid out before, I think Marcus Davenport, and unfortunately a lot of this is going to have to do with, like, is he able to be healthy? But I think that if he's out there for a significant amount of time, one, he's been kind of a role player in the past, but when you talk about when he's on the field, like, what does he do? Even last year with Minnesota, Dan Campbell brought it up, like, even in the small amount that he played, he was still effective when he was out there. From run defense to pass rush efficiency, I do feel like my early prediction, Marcus Davenport's going to get extended beyond this year because he's going to play that well this season. That's kind of my early prediction. So I have buy-in there, but then also the aspect that it does complement Hutchinson's skill set well. Have also, including Marcus Davenport, is that they have Josh Paschal, who will have a role. He's going to play defensive end, and he doesn't win around the edge with speed or kind of, you know, the flexibility on the edge. He's going to win through your offensive tackle, like John Kaminsky will as well. That's what the Lions are looking for. He also touched on a little bit of DJ Reader, and he said that, you know, everybody has their different takes, from the scouts to the GM to me, but this was one that everybody was on board with, was DJ Reader. Like, just watching the film of Reader was like, hey, this guy can get an edge as pass rusher, awesome as a run defender. You love the energy that he also plays with, and then also the leadership aspect, which he brought up in terms of the off the field as well. Yeah, DJ Reader was easy for me. I mean, didn't matter who became available at defensive tackle. That's why he was just remained number one, even after we heard about Wilkins, because DJ Reader, one, he fits so well to me, but then also the aspect of, yes, the guy is a dog. It just makes so much sense, and he talked about kind of like adding that with Elaine McNeil. I'm loving the idea of those two guys playing together. I think that's just absolutely nasty. That is amazing. I think that's really maybe the best combination the Lions could have put together, is putting someone with McNeil, or outside of doing that at cornerback. I think that was the best, like, 1-2 the Lions could have put together this offseason, because it just felt so darn necessary the Lions figure that out. And my goodness, they just took a massive upgrade. And the draft was just like a weird fit. It was like, you can do it. One, I don't really see that prospect early in the draft. And then two, it's like, okay, that's still the draft pick. Like, you're expecting that you're one. That's usually not how draft picks are going to pan out. We've had great success with that, but that's usually not what's going to work, especially when you're picking this late in the draft. So for the Lions to hit that in free agency, they knocked such a big need out there. Also touched on Amik Robertson, and what I loved about this was it seemingly worked out perfectly, because as he touched on, when they were talking to Amik Robertson, they then got the Carlton Davis deal done, but Amik Robertson was the guy that kind of like pushed it forward, and he was like, hey, are we going to do this or not? So shout out to Amik Robertson, because with him kind of pushing this whole situation forward, it ended up where if the Lions weren't aware of necessarily the Cam Sutton situation at that time, and then they didn't necessarily bring in Amik Robertson because they had acquired Carlton Davis, now we'd be looking at the quarterback position saying we definitely have to make an addition there. But because he pushed it forward, now you're like, okay, this actually looks fine. Cornerback position doesn't seem that light. It's actually, I think, in a really solid position. You can address it, you can add to it, but it's at a spot where it's like, hey, you have to play tomorrow. I like the depth that we have. I mean, between Emmanuel Mosley, Carlton Davis, Amik Robertson throwing that, you got three guys that you can trust out wide. Love the addition of getting Khalil Dorsey back at slot. You obviously have your guy in Brian Branch there. I really like what the Lions have at the cornerback position. That's not talking about even some of the young guys like Stephen Gilmore. So it was actually massive that worked out and that happened, because it actually helped us a ton with what popped up with the Cam Sutton situation. And then, of course, you have a guy like Kevin Zeitler, who, according to Dan Campbell, they didn't expect to be available that late in free agency. They thought he'd be off early, which makes tons of sense, because Kevin Zeitler has been, even though at his older age, he's been extremely durable, extremely reliable, more reliable than, you know, the Jonah Jackson situation in terms of just games played. But then also, he's been a great player. Like, there's been no drop off at any point in time, and I like how Dan Campbell looks at it with the glass half full of, like, not looking at like, hey, we're an older offensive line, we better get young here, but this is a very smart veteran offensive line across the board, between now Taylor Decker, Kevin Zeitler, Graham Glasgow, Frank Ragnow. I mean, you can even throw Penei Sewell now going into the final year of his rookie deal. So for the Lions right now in the offensive line, he looks at it from that aspect. I think they did take the step forward, as Dan Campbell said, just in terms of they improved going from Kevin Zeitler from the Jonah Jackson situation, but it did make it it sound like that there was intrigue in bringing back Jonah Jackson. It just didn't get done. I thought coming into the Lions would re-sign him. I also didn't think his price point get that high, and then once we heard what it got to with the Rams, I wouldn't have given that deal. So that may have been just a situation that the Lions kind of went through there, and it's like, all right, he's getting more from this team than what we were going to offer. So that's how the situation kind of just happened. But the fact that he was still available, it fit like a glove for the Lions. And then the fact they were able to get it done on a one-year deal just made it work out perfectly for the Lions. He just stood out amongst the rest as free agency kind of rolled along. Guys started to get picked out of free agency, and then they're like, I don't really think there's any future options here. But Kevin Zeitler's just sitting there like, hey, I'm actually an improvement for your offensive line. And you sign him, and it works perfectly. Now with Corey Sourstill, if you want to address it in the draft, you could potentially work out who's going to be the future here. But like with nose tackles, like, yo, you got your dudes. Like, you have your dudes now on the roster. So it's awesome to be able to address that like they did. And a quick little note to cornerback that I will make, talk about the importance of that, whether that's looking at the statistics, looking at that Green Bay game, and how against zone coverage, man, I mean, if you have the offensive line, you have the play caller, right? You have the quarterback being able to get to that. But there's also teams that we've seen historically, whether that's Seattle. If you look at like Chicago, who Dan Campbell gave love to, like you can kind of know, like Chicago, they'll play a lot of cover three, and you get like man principles at times, especially out wide in those spots. But at the same time, you may know what they like to do and what their tendency is. But the question is just, can you beat it? Like, everybody knows what Seattle was kind of built around coverage-wise and schematically. And even though they had their own tweaks to it, it was like, but can you beat the coverage? You might have an idea of what we want to do, but can you actually get open? Can you actually get guys to football? And it's like, no, you can't. That's the problem with the defense is you still have issues even if you know what they want to do. So he was kind of asked about, like, hey, are extensions a priority? Yes, they are a priority. St. Brown, Jared Goff, those guys, I expect those to be on their way at some point in time. Malik McNeil, I'd throw him into there. Even then you wait about guys like Iffy, of course, going into year two. They'll probably want to see more from him. Certain guys like that, but there's a few that are just like, they feel like no-brainers. Aleem McNeil, Jared Goff, St. Brown, to me, they're just no-brainers. I think at some point we're going to see those things get done. But the big thing about the draft that I like that he brought up is the fact that there could be a lot of guys this year that are drafted that aren't starters right away. And usually that's how you prepare for the draft. Obviously, if you go first round, you expect that they can give you year one production. But you don't grade a draft like Brad Holmes said earlier this offseason after year one. They've had a lot of success with guys who've been able to make year one, year two impact. So I feel like they got ahead of the process because they're building through the draft, yet they're getting so much impact early for these young players. But now it can fit in a lot more naturally where it's like, hey, a lot of these guys may not be starters immediately, but that's great because for Dan Campbell, it's going to raise the floor. Obviously, you have to have that depth. It's going to push the veterans. But at the same time, it also gives a lot of these players an opportunity. And then you talk about who you draft too, but it gives them an opportunity to fill into those roles in time. And the Lions at a lot of key positions are kind of set up that way, specifically now with interior defensive line and also on the offensive line with like, hey, we have vets, guys that are going to start. They're going to be good players. It's not like we just have old veterans here. We have legit good players, great players in the NFL at these spots. But now we also can open up that window for them in time to step into those roles so it can feel a little bit more natural. But I like how he brought up the fact that in the past it was like, hey, we always drafted best player available. When you have so many needs, you can always point to like, hey, you drafted at linebacker, but it actually was kind of a need, so it just works itself out. Now you really may not necessarily notice that all the time with every Lions draft pick, right? Because even in the first year, I remember they took back-to-back D tackles and were like, what the heck are the Lions doing? So even then it was like, what are we doing? Even in the first year. But now it can be very much more clear to recognize like, okay, that's not maybe the biggest need, but the Lions were able to draft it because they don't have necessarily all these glaring holes everywhere. They still have places to upgrade for sure, but they don't have glaring holes everywhere. So obviously it's a great benefit heading into this year's draft. But that's really what Dan Campbell hit on today that I wanted to touch on. Expect the extensions. They're going to start happening, but the Lions have time on those things, but I just expect those to happen. I'm going to leave it right there. Let me know your thoughts, comments below. Stay tuned for the mock drafts tonight, and I'm out.